Here is the adapter plate on the engine, and what I've realized is the locator dowel on the engine lines up perfectly with the locator dowel from the Ford. So if I tip this just slightly more, at about 19 degrees, I was like 18 and a half before, that lines up perfectly. And if you look, that's about, the camera is about vertical on the adapter plate right now. So that means the engine's just tilted slightly that direction, and that's going to work. I think that's going to work pretty well. So I'm going to get rid of this little dowel I stuck in there and drill that out just a touch until it fits over the VW dowel. And that's one down, and then all I need to do is drill the location for this dowel on this end. So you can see now how I use this piece of brass to locate on that pilot bearing. And the pilot bearing that's in here is that one that I got from Napa that I mentioned in the other video. That's that. So here it is with the same hole that I had the locator in from the Ford. Sits perfectly right here. So all I need to do is get a longer dowel, and I'll be locating from the engine straight through the adapter plate right into the transmission. And here it is, the adapter plate on the engine. Here it is. I think I say here it is a lot. Anyway, you can see the starter is definitely not going to work. If this is the middle of our starter, that's right in the middle of the oil pan. So that's definitely out of the picture. Those three holes are going to get dropped. I'll probably just bring the adapter plate around like this. Nice curve with the bell housing, and drill in that hole. This hole worked beautifully. This hole I had to add, and you can see I missed it just slightly. So I've scribed, I had to kind of walk the hole a little bit, and I've scribed the line right here to show the edge of the hole that needs to be true when the machine shop does it. Okay, so now that those are in, I have one problem bolt right there. Those are mighty close. Look at that. They'll work, but that's awfully close. And over here, gotta add that guy, gotta add that guy, and these three down here. And we should be good to go. Drilled all these other holes out. You can see they're not completely drilled through yet, but they're in place. And if I get a straight shot, you can see I was able to start with the small. I started by scoring an X. You can see some of the X still there. So once I had that scored, I started really small and just worked my way up, staying on center with all these holes. So I got 3 down around here and 3 up here. This one should have been a bell housing bolt, but rather than putting bolting the plate there, because of this other bell housing bolt from the Ford, you can see I've outlined that. These two are just going to be too close, so I'm not going to use this hole to bolt the plate to the engine. I'm going to use this hole up here, which is actually a bolt hole to bolt a coolant tube from the output from the thermostat housing. The tube runs along here, comes up, runs across and out this way. I'm just going to get rid of that and redo it somehow else and use that hole. It's a slightly smaller hole to bolt the plate, so it has some support up here. This is going to have to be, this is the same size thread as these holes down here. So it's a slightly smaller bolt than these, but I think it's going to suffice. It's actually, you can see there, it's the same bracket on the block. It's just a different hole. Here's where the starter would have mounted. Obviously, the Ford starter can't go there. It's the middle of the oil pan. So after I get the flywheel on here and these things drilled out and stuff, I think the starter is going to have to end up somewhere on this end. Let me get this clamp out of here. Maybe we can shed some light on that now. I'm going to have to avoid this dowel because I need the locator for the Ford Trans. So maybe I can stick the starter here with a couple starter bolts like that. Here it is. I just set it up, bolted it on after all the holes were drilled out, and then with a hammer just tapped this until it popped off. But we have all our holes in, and time to put the flywheel on. Stupidly, I forgot to leave extra plastic over here for my starter bolt, so that was dumb. Oh well. So here's the adapter plate, and I had one of these locator pins put in. It's just a brass bushing that I got at the hardware store, which fits the Ranger transmission well. The other one over here actually lines up with one of the Volkswagen locator pins, but the Ranger transmission is just slightly small. So I'm going to use a stepper bit to drill this hole out a little bit to match the Volkswagen. So I drilled out the locator pin on the Ranger just a little bit so that it'll line up with the same size pin as the Volkswagen had. So this is still the small size dowel on from the Ranger, the original Ranger size. This one is expanded to the Volkswagen size, and you can see I didn't press that pin all the way in. I left a little step so that we can locate still on the Volkswagen, and these now line up. There we go, right with the Ranger. So that lines this plate up on the Ranger, and what I need to do is grind the pin down on the Volkswagen engine so that it'll sit inside this but not press this pin out. So that's what we're going to do next. And it's all bolted up here. I've pressed in this adapter, or this locator pin on here, which is slightly oversized because it lined up with the Volkswagen. So the Volkswagen, I went with the Volkswagen size, drilled this out, used that locator pin, and drilled out the bell housing on the Ford to match this size. So that's the Ford size, this is the Volkswagen size. Bolts up here well. I can see that bolt hole is going to be blocked. This bolt hole is going to be blocked. So I'm going to get both of these two bolts from the transmission trimmed, and then I should be ready to bolt this whole thing up to the transmission. The only problem is I don't have any starter location yet. So once I trim these bolts down, I'm going to bolt this plate permanently back to the engine, put the flywheel on, locate the starter. Once the starter is in place, we can bolt it up to the transmission. Okay, had to trim this bolt down, that bolt out, right there, or down, and trim this one down because the engine block interferes with these two. Okay, I ran into a little bit of trouble figuring out where I was going to place the starter because of this locator pin right here that goes into the Ford transmission bell housing. So whenever I would put the starter up, I'm like, well, if that's where the starter needs to sit, how am I going to avoid that? Well, by using the Volkswagen starter, which has all this extra space out front, I'm able to actually, I think, block the starter off the back of the adapter plate that much, which will allow me to miss that bolt hole. And while I'll have to bolt the engine to the transmission through that hole and then mount the starter like this, it'll still work. So I think that's going to be my plan of action, to allow all these pieces to come together. So I'm going to need to have a block built that'll block it off that far, avoid that location for the bolt hole, and avoid the edge of the engine block there, but I think it'll work fine. So that's where I'm at right now. I haven't been as faithful with this video and keeping it all logical and seamless and stuff as I probably should have been, but here's the blank that I had ground out for the starter. This fits the starter well, and I had this cut out at the machine shop, and I've just tacked it in really ugly. I didn't clean up it or anything. I just tacked it on there with the welder. And basically I just measured how far out this protrusion is to figure out when this is in that flange. I actually have it in upside down right now. With it like this, with the solenoid on top, I think it'll interfere with the turbo. So it's going to actually be upside down with the solenoid on the bottom, and that does just barely fit. You can see that lines us up right there with those teeth, and looks like just the right depth to where it'll come out right into the starter teeth. So this is the VW starter, the stock VW starter, and I've just tacked this in place. I just took the starter to the machine shop and said, here, cut me out a blank, and this is what they cut me that would fit that starter. And then I said, okay, this isn't quite gonna work, I need this trimmed down 1/4 inch like it says here, and then from this point center on can be straight, and over here I need to stay closer about 1/4 inch, and then from here I can cut out, because I needed a little more clearance on the block, for the block here and for a bell housing bolt here. I just got really limited, so I had them cut that and cut it out of 1 1/4 inch steel, and the result was this piece here. You can see how it's almost that other blank, it's just trimmed down and out along the edge. So I'm going to take this whole thing off now and weld this permanently up to that plate. I'll have to extend a tube along here for that bolt, and we'll just have a longer bell housing bolt, because this is an important bell housing bolt. It's funky, but you know, this whole job is. So here we go. Here's something I wasn't able to shoot in that last video. I had to grind this round with an angle grinder. You can see right there are casting numbers, maybe you can see XG37, there it is. So once I started buzzing this, I realized, oh, I want to leave those on there, XG37. So I just took this round out, and I was actually able to leave this fine the way it is, and it just barely, that starter literally just barely fits. I mean, it's touching this, and that's the only place it can go, because if it was to go any higher, the turbo's right here, so can't go any higher. If it did go higher, it would start to lose clearance on that key. This is the only spot. I'm so lucky that it actually fit here. Now we just have to hope when we get to the truck that it fits there too. Right. So I've got the block welded in for the starter, and because of this bolt hole, which locates into that locator dowel, I had to put on this extension so that when the starter goes on like this, the head doesn't interfere down here or up here. So I'm going to cut this off right about here, and that's where the bolt will bolt all the way through that and into the transmission. For this right here, I had to actually cut back the tube enough back like this to clear the starter, and with the starter sitting there, you can just barely see the starter sticking through there, but it's not going to interfere with the bolt going through into the transmission. So like I said, this is really precise and just barely fits the way we need it to. But there it is. Also, I had to grind this away because this is where the block is on this end. So I couldn't move the starter anymore this way because of the block, couldn't move it anymore this way because of this tube, and I couldn't move it down any because of this hole and the block wrapping around here on the lower mount. So that's where the starter is going to sit. In the ideal world, this is now done. Here's what we've got. An out of focus camera. Come on, camera. There we go. Got a bolt through here. This will be an actual starter bolt, and that'll be accessible from outside the bell housing once the bell housing is on. Here's the bell housing bolt that goes through that locator. This is so close that the starter actually touches the bolt. I will stop this and turn on the light so that you can see that. There it is. You can see that the starter housing just barely touches the bolt. What I'm actually going to do is just trim down the side of the starter housing just slightly, but I want to make sure that this whole thing will work so that should anybody else come along by this truck and replace the starter at some point, it'll still fit up even with a stock starter not trimmed. But for the ease of just giving myself a little clearance there, not having any funny pressure on the starter, I'm going to go ahead and probably just buzz down maybe a 1/16 off the outside of this starter housing. But here it is, it's bolted through. There's the bolt for the starter, and because of the situation with this notch in this tube with the starter, I'm going to need to weld a nut in here and then have a bolt that's just the right length to bolt through from the outside, because if I try to weld in this bolt as a stud and just use a nut here, I can't get the starter over that stud while I'm putting it on and avoid this notch that I had to put in. So what I'm going to have to do is weld a nut back in here so that you can just stick the starter on and send a bolt in from the outside. Down here, it'll be a bolt and a nut, and it's accessible from the outside. Anybody could do it. So, starter is mounted. Flywheel is mounted. Here's the gear that comes out. I'll show you this engaging. I have the starter motor wire undone, so all you'll see is the solenoid kick in right here. Perfect. There it is. Lines up beautifully. And let me hook a wrench up to this thing. If I could turn the engine just slightly, you can see that starter just drops right back off of it. So there it is. It's all together. So now it's time to stick this up to the transmission, bolt it together, trim down what aluminum I need to on the bell housing to make everything work, and we're good to go. I've had to do a lot of rework. Cut out the starter, realized the new starter that I'm going to fit on here doesn't fit the starter from the Ranger, so I had to cut out. We're actually going to end up losing a dowel hole now, which means we'll have only 5, which means we'll lose that bolt as well. We'll have 5 bolts holding the bell housing on. One here, one here, one here, one here, one here. Not one here. So maybe we can drill this into the aluminum on the bell housing and tap something in. I don't know, we'll see. Otherwise, we've got 5 bolts and these starter bolts. So starter bolts can still go through to the bell housing and bolt on, so there'll be some extra strength there. That will get us past center across here, which is good. It'd be great if we could end up adding one more down here, but we'll see how that all works out. For now, I've got this big gaping hole and a starter right here on a plate that can be welded into place. Something like that. And that's where the starter's going to sit. Here's the starter plate welded into place, just tacked, but I tacked it on top, tacked it on the bottom, wanted a tighter fit for my teeth, thought I wasn't quite meshing as deeply as I wanted to, so I cut the bottom one, hit it with a hammer to tap it over, just to line it up a little bit tighter here. Once I thought I had that positioning, welded the bottom a little again, and now if we connect our battery, whoops,
Yeah, that's turning the right direction, and I think we're in business. You can see I trimmed down this plate so that I wouldn't hit the bearing here as I was fitting it up. So I'm gonna weld down here, weld across, probably trim off the bottom of this and wrap the weld around. I don't know, it just looks stupid. Here's the adapter plate with the new starter plate welded on. Got that all welded on this side and on this side, and that sets the starter away from the deck of the TDI by 1/4 inch. Here's the adapter plate bolted up to the engine with the starter bolted up. You can see it sits nicely right there alongside the engine, tucked in well, out of the way of where the turbo will sit. There it is. Now we just need to add the flywheel and it cranks over. Boom. Here it is with the starter and flywheel on. And here it is cranking. That's it. Yeah.